Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight, we're slipping through the heavy oak doors of a medieval monastery, where the air smells of beeswax candles and fresh-baked bread, and somewhere in the shadows, a young monk is passing a folded piece of parchment to someone who definitely isn't supposed to be reading love notes. You're about to discover that behind those thick stone walls, human nature refused to be contained by even the strictest religious vows. And honestly, if you'd been forced to wake up at 2 a.m. every night for prayers in a freezing chapel, you'd probably be looking for some warmth and companionship too. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. All right, let's begin the story. You're standing in the courtyard of a Benedictine monastery in the year 1287, and the first thing that hits you is how alive this place feels. It's nothing like the silent, austere image you might have imagined. Chickens scatter across the cobblestones as a lay brother hurries past with a wheelbarrow full of turnips. The bell tower looms above, ready to divide your day into 8 strict prayer sessions, and through an arched doorway, you glimpse robed figures bent over illuminated manuscripts in the scriptorium. This is your new home. You've just taken your vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and that middle one, well, that's going to be more complicated than anyone's letting on. The medieval monastery system was essentially a spiritual fortress, designed to separate its inhabitants from worldly temptations. You'd think that would be straightforward enough. Build high walls, enforce strict schedules, segregate the sexes. Done. But here's what the church authorities kept discovering to their eternal frustration. You can lock bodies behind walls, but you can't lock away human nature. These communities housed anywhere from a dozen to several hundred religious men or women, all supposedly dedicated to a life of prayer, work, and celibacy. The rule of St. Benedict, which most Western monasteries followed, laid out exactly how you should spend every waking moment. You'd rise for matins in the dead of night, shuffle through 7 more prayer services, work in the gardens or workshops, eat your meager meals in silence while someone reads scripture aloud, and theoretically spend any free moment in holy contemplation. But let's be real about who actually ended up in these places. Sure, you had your genuinely devout soul seeking spiritual perfection, but you also had second sons with no inheritance, daughters whose families couldn't afford dowries, political prisoners in all but name, and people fleeing everything from bad marriages to criminal charges. Historians still argue whether the majority of medieval monastics had genuine religious vocations or were simply making the best of limited options. The mainstream historical fact you need to know is that by the 12th century, there were over 15,000 monasteries across Europe. The quirky tidbit? Some monasteries actually had waiting lists because they offered better food and healthcare than most people could get in the outside world. Kind of like a medieval retirement community with really early wake-up calls. Your daily routine is designed to exhaust both body and spirit into submission. You wake to the clanging bell at 2 a.m., stumble through the freezing cloister to the chapel, and stand through an hour of chanted prayers while your breath forms clouds in the candlelit darkness. Back to bed for a few precious hours, then up again at dawn for lauds. After that, it's work. Maybe you're assigned to the brewery. Yes, monks made excellent beer, ostensibly for nutritional purposes. Or perhaps you're copying manuscripts until your fingers cramp and your eyes blur. The meals are simple: bread, porridge, vegetables from the garden, maybe some fish on feast days. Meat is rare unless you're in the infirmary claiming illness, and wouldn't you know it? The infirmary is always surprisingly full. The vow of celibacy wasn't just about avoiding sex. It was about achieving a state of spiritual purity that would bring you closer to God. In theory, you were supposed to become like the angels, transcending your base human desires to focus entirely on divine love. The Church Fathers wrote extensively about how sexual desire was the devil's favorite tool, how women were naturally tempting, thanks, Eve, and how true holiness required complete rejection of carnal thoughts. They'd clearly never tried to enforce this on thousands of young people locked together in close quarters, with nothing but prayer and manual labor to occupy their time. The theological gymnastics required to justify mandatory celibacy would make your head spin faster than a monk caught sneaking out after Compline. You see, the early Christian church didn't actually require celibacy from its clergy. St. Peter himself had a wife, and for the first 1,000 years, plenty of priests and even bishops maintained families. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, the church decided that spiritual purity demanded complete separation from sexual activity. The logic went something like this. Christ was celibate. Therefore, the most perfect Christians should imitate him. Sex was inherently polluting, even within marriage, because it involved loss of rational control and submission to animal instincts. And here's the real kicker, that they didn't advertise quite as loudly. Celibate clergy couldn't produce legitimate heirs to inherit church property, which kept those valuable lands and treasures firmly under ecclesiastical control. You're sitting through another interminable sermon about the virgin martyrs, and Brother Thomas is really getting worked up about Saint Agnes preserving her purity unto death. The theological framework surrounding monastic celibacy drew heavily from St. Augustine, who, fun fact, spent his youth in what we might delicately call extensive romantic experimentation before his conversion. Augustine argued that sexual desire was humanity's punishment for original sin, that before the fall, Adam and Eve would have reproduced without lust, like planting seeds in a garden. You try not to snicker at this image, and the medieval theologians built on this foundation, creating elaborate hierarchies of sexual sin, nocturnal emissions, venial sin, but only if you didn't enjoy the dream, masturbation, mortal sin, straight to hell unless confessed. Actual intercourse, well, that opened up a whole taxonomy of damnation depending on the participants, positions, and purposes involved. The monastic theorists developed an entire vocabulary around celibacy and its violations. There was concupiscence, the technical term for lust that sounds much fancier in Latin. Incontinence meant lack of sexual self-control, which is ironic considering how many monks suffered from actual digestive incontinence thanks to their bean-heavy diet. They distinguished between sins of thought, word, and deed, with elaborate penalties for each. Thinking lustful thoughts during prayers, say 50 extra paternosters, speaking words of romantic affection, bread and water for a week, or actually touching someone inappropriately. That could mean public flogging, though historians still argue whether these punishments were consistently applied or mainly used as threats. But here's where the theology got really twisted. The church simultaneously taught that marriage was a holy sacrament, and that celibacy was spiritually superior. You'd have married parish priests preaching about the sanctity of matrimony, while being told by their bishops that they were spiritually inferior to celibate monks. The cognitive dissonance was spectacular. Some theologians tried to square this circle by arguing that marriage was good for preventing worse sins, Basically, better to marry than burn with lust. But virginity was best for achieving spiritual perfection. This created a hierarchy where virgins stood at the top. Widows who remained chaste came second, and married people occupied the bottom rung of holiness, still saved, but definitely riding in the economy section to heaven. The really fascinating quirk that medieval manuscripts reveal is how much time monks spent thinking about sex while trying not to think about sex. They produced countless treatises on the dangers of women, the importance of custody of the eyes, not looking at anything arousing, and techniques for suppressing desire, cold baths, sparse diet, sleeping on hard surfaces, wearing rough clothing, all designed to mortify the flesh. Some monks even wore hair shirts or chains under their robes, the medieval equivalent of a very uncomfortable reminder to keep it in your pants. The mainstream historical consensus shows that these extreme practices often backfired, creating an obsession with the very desires they were meant to suppress. You're learning that the monastery library contains some surprisingly explicit texts, all for educational purposes. Of course, there's Burchard of Worm's Penitential Manual, which reads like a medieval sex survey with its exhaustive list of possible sins and their penances. Have you done what certain women are accustomed to do, contriving a certain engine or implement in the form of the male member, of a size to match your desire, it asks, before prescribing 5 years of penance on feast days. The detail is extraordinary, covering everything from bestiality to position preferences, all in the name of helping confessors properly categorize and address sexual sins. You can't help but wonder how many monks read these instructional texts with perhaps more interest than purely professional. The Church Fathers also worried extensively about particular friendships, intense emotional bonds between monks that might lead to physical expression. The rule of St. Benedict specifically warned against showing favoritism or forming exclusive relationships within the community. Yet monastery records are full of passionate letters between spiritual friends that sound suspiciously like love letters with a thin veneer of religious vocabulary. "My soul thirsts for you like a deer for water," one 12th century monk wrote to another, adding, "I long to be dissolved and be with you in Christ." Purely spiritual, obviously. The reality of who actually ended up taking monastic vows would have made the Church Fathers weep into their communion wine. You're watching the latest batch of novices arrive at the monastery gates, and it's like witnessing a medieval career fair gone horribly wrong. There's young William, the third son of a minor noble who's here because his older brothers got the castle and the military career, leaving him with the choice between the church or trying his luck as a landless knight. Spoiler: landless knights usually ended up as brigands or corpses. Next to him stands Thomas, whose merchant father decided that having a son in the monastery would be great for business connections and spiritual insurance. And that skinny kid trying not to cry. That's Robert, who showed a bit too much interest in reading and not enough in swordplay. So clearly, he must have a religious vocation. The age at which people entered monastic life would scandalize modern sensibilities. Children as young as 7 could be given as oblates, essentially donated to monasteries by their parents. Imagine hitting puberty, surrounded by other hormonal teenagers, all supposedly committed to lifetime celibacy, with no sex education beyond, "Don't do it or you'll burn in hell." The church required novices to be at least 16 before taking final vows, but plenty of documentary evidence shows younger children being accepted when accompanied by suitable donations. These kids grew up knowing nothing but monastery life, their sexual awakening happening within walls dedicated to suppressing exactly those feelings. It's like running a weight loss camp inside a chocolate factory and wondering why everyone keeps sneaking treats. You notice how the arrival of new novices always creates a stir in the normally routine-bound community. The younger monks suddenly volunteer for duties that happen to pass by the novice quarters. There's more hair combing happening in the week before profession ceremonies than in the entire previous month. Even the older brothers seem more animated, perhaps remembering their own arrival years ago. The mainstream historical record shows that monasteries typically experience their highest rates of disciplinary issues in the months following large groups of new arrivals. Coincidence? The abbot certainly hopes so, but his weary expression suggests otherwise. The biological reality of celibacy hit different people in different ways. You've got Brother Francis, who genuinely seems to have sublimated all romantic desires into an intense relationship with his manuscript illuminations, his marginalia features and suspicious number of very buff angels. Then there's Brother Hugh, who channels everything into competitive vegetable growing. His cabbages are magnificent, and he speaks to them more tenderly than some men speak to their wives. But for every successful sublimator, there are others clearly struggling. Brother Marcus fasts so often he's practically translucent. Brother Philip volunteers for every physically exhausting task available. And Brother John? Well, Brother John spends a lot of time in confession. Here's a quirky, historical tidbit that really drives home the hormonal reality. Medieval monasteries kept detailed infirmary records, and acedia, spiritual listlessness often accompanying sexual frustration, was one of the most common ailments. Symptoms included restlessness, inability to concentrate on prayers, excessive daydreaming, and mysterious illnesses that required bed rest, where, presumably, the afflicted could daydream in private. Some monasteries reported that up to a third of their population suffered from acedia at any given time, especially in spring. Yes, even monks got spring fever. The recommended treatment? More prayer, harder work, and colder baths. Shockingly, the cure rate was not impressive. The class dynamics within monasteries added another layer of complication. Noble-born monks often arrived with servants, better educations, and expectations of eventually holding leadership positions. They kept their aristocratic attitudes even after taking vows of humility. Meanwhile, commoner monks did most of the manual labor and received less prestigious assignments. This created natural tension and hierarchies that sometimes express themselves in ways the rule of St. Benedict definitely didn't intend. Historians still argue whether the documented particular friendships between nobles and their favoured common-born brothers represented genuine affection crossing class lines or exploitation dressed up in religious language. You're beginning to understand that the monastery recruitment process was basically a recipe for disaster. Take dozens or hundreds of people with minimal genuine religious vocation. Mix in natural biological urges. Add power dynamics and close quarters. Season with boredom and repression. Then act shocked when things get spicy. The wonder isn't that romantic and sexual relationships happened in monasteries. It's that they didn't happen more often. Or perhaps they did. And medieval record keepers were just very good at euphemism. When the chronicles mention a monk being disciplined for excessive familiarity or particular affection, you're starting to read between the lines. The most telling evidence comes from the visitation records. Periodic inspections by bishops or abbots general meant to ensure proper observance of rules. These documents read like a medieval reality show transcript. Brother A and Brother B have been seen walking together after Compline, Sister C sends unnecessary messages to the men's dormitory. Multiple brothers report disturbances in the night hours. The infirmarian requests investigation into why so many monks claim illness during the full moon. The visitors clearly knew what they were looking for, which suggests this wasn't exactly a rare problem. The architectural layout of your average medieval monastery was theoretically designed to prevent exactly the kind of shenanigans that definitely weren't supposed to be happening behind those stone walls. You're walking through the cloister, that square-covered walkway that connects all the main buildings, and you can't help but notice how many dark corners and hidden alcoves this supposedly supervision-friendly design actually creates. The architects claimed they were following divine geometric principles, but apparently God's blueprint included plenty of blind spots where two people could have a quick whispered conversation or more without being seen from the main thoroughfares. The standard monastery plan followed what historians call the rule of Saint Benedict layout, which sounds official until you realize it's basically just common sense mixed with wishful thinking about human behavior. You've got your church dominating one side, usually the north, because nothing says God is watching, like a massive stone building blocking out the sun. The dormitory sits on the east side, supposedly catching the morning light to help monks wake for matins, though in reality it just means everyone's exhausted and squinting during prime. The refectory, dining hall, takes the south side, with the kitchen conveniently attached so the cooking smells can torment you during fasting periods. The west side typically housed the solarium, storage, and the lay brothers' quarters, creating a nice barrier between the choir monks and the outside world. But here's where things get interesting from a romantic logistics standpoint. The night stairs led directly from the dormitory to the church, allowing monks to stumble to midnight prayers without going outside. Officially, this was for convenience and to maintain silence. Unofficially, those dark stairs became superhighways for anyone wanting to slip away unnoticed. You just had to time it right. Wait for everyone to file back to bed after matins, then make your move. The acoustic properties of stone staircases meant you could hear someone coming from flights away, giving plenty of warning to abort any clandestine missions. The warming room, or calfactory, was another architectural feature with unintended consequences. This was the only heated room besides the kitchen, where monks could warm themselves during winter months. Historians still argue whether the documented popularity of the warming room stemmed purely from physical comfort or the privacy offered by its usually remote location. The rule allowed monks to visit it at specified times, but enforcement varied wildly. Some winter nights, you'd find half the monastery huddled around that single fireplace, creating perfect conditions for accidental touches and meaningful glances across the flames. You discover that the most dangerous architectural feature for maintaining celibacy was probably the garden. Every monastery needed extensive gardens for food and medicinal herbs, often with orchards, fish ponds, and various outbuildings scattered throughout. These spaces required constant maintenance, providing legitimate reasons to be outside the main cloister. The garden sheds, tool storage buildings, and seasonal work shelters offered privacy that the main monastery buildings deliberately avoided. When Brother Stephen volunteers for extra garden duty during apple harvest season, claiming sudden devotion to pomology, nobody's really fooled. The quirky historical detail. Some monasteries actually started requiring garden work to be done in groups of 3 or more, specifically to prevent occasions of sin among the vegetables. The infirmary complex presented another architectural challenge to celibacy enforcement. Sick monks needed isolation from the healthy population, which meant separate buildings with private cells, a luxury in an era when most monks slept in common dormitories. The infirmarian had significant autonomy, deciding who was sick enough to require privacy and special dietary exemptions, including meat and wine for medicinal purposes. The mainstream historical consensus suggests that infirmaries saw suspiciously high occupancy rates during major feast seasons when discipline elsewhere was strictest. Develop a convenient cough during Lent, and you might find yourself in a private room with wine, meat, and remarkably flexible visiting hours. The scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied, had its own romantic potential. While silence was strictly enforced during work hours, the concentrated nature of the task meant scribes often worked in pairs, one reading aloud while the other wrote. This created legitimate reasons for close physical proximity and whispered consultations about unclear passages. The evidence lies in the margins of surviving manuscripts, where supposedly professional scribes doodled hearts, wrote acrostic poems, and occasionally penned notes like, "Brother M has beautiful hands," in tiny script between the lines of biblical commentary. The head librarian must have spent half his time pretending not to notice the romantic subtext in collaborative projects. Even the chapter house, where daily meetings and disciplinary proceedings occurred, had architectural features that could facilitate romance. The stone benches around the walls created natural gathering spots before and after official meetings. The acoustic properties that allowed a single speaker to address the room also meant whispered conversations in corners carried further than intended. More than one illicit relationship was exposed when participants thought their quiet planning was masked by the general murmur of monks gathering for chapter, only to realize their voices had carried perfectly to the abbot's seat. The architectural irony was spectacular. Buildings designed to promote communal observation and eliminate privacy succeeded mainly in teaching monks to be exceptionally creative about finding loopholes. The ingenuity of lovesick monks and nuns trying to communicate across gender lines would put modern teenagers with smartphones to shame. You're watching Brother Francis feed the monastery's messenger pigeons, and you can't help but notice that one particular bird seems to make an awful lot of navigational errors, repeatedly landing on the wrong side of the valley where the convent of St. Mary just happens to be located. When questioned, Brother Francis launches into an elaborate explanation about magnetic fields and avian cognition that would sound more convincing if he weren't blushing like a choir boy caught sampling the communion wine. The official channels of communication between male and female religious houses were strictly regulated. Letters required approval from superiors, had to concern legitimate business matters, and were supposedly read by multiple parties before delivery. This system worked about as well as you'd expect when the people enforcing it were also human beings who remembered what romance felt like. The mainstream historical record shows numerous instances of administrative correspondence that somehow required weekly updates about grain storage, with postscripts mentioning how the roses in the convent garden reminded Sister Marguerite of divine beauty and earthly suffering, subtle as a brick through a stained glass window, but apparently subtle enough for abbesses who chose to look the other way. You discover that the real innovation happened in the margins, literally. Illuminated manuscripts sent between monasteries for copying provided perfect cover for coded messages, that decorative border full of ivy and birds. Look closer, and you'll find flowers that spell out names in the medieval language of plants. The quirky historical tidbit that makes you grin is that one 13th century breviary contains an entire love poem hidden in the decorated capital letters of the Psalms. The first letter of each psalm, when read in sequence, declares, "Beatrice, your eyes outshine the morning star." Some poor monk spent months creating that, all while maintaining perfect theological accuracy in the actual text. That's dedication that would make modern relationship effort look lazy. The monastery's sign language system, originally developed to maintain silence during meals and prayer, evolved into something far more versatile. Officially, you had signs for basic needs: bread, water, prayer book. Unofficially, creative combinations could convey surprisingly complex messages. Touching your chin while pointing at the door didn't just mean beard at entrance among the initiated. It meant the bearded brother will create a distraction at the entrance during Vespers. The sign for fish, followed by touching your heart, apparently meant, "I'll be at the fish pond after Compline." When the abbot noticed an unusual increase in fish-related gestural conversations, he probably should have investigated further. The most elaborate communication systems developed in double monasteries, where male and female communities shared facilities like churches while maintaining theoretical separation. The architectural requirement for separate seating created perfect sightlines across the nave. During the lengthy divine office, you had hours of opportunity to develop a sophisticated system of prayer book positions, rosary movements, and strategic coughing. Historians still argue whether certain documented liturgical innovations in these communities, like synchronized genuflections and coordinated page turns, were genuine spiritual practices or complex messaging systems. The fact that these practices often disappeared immediately after visitations suggests the latter. Physical objects became loaded with meaning in this communication economy. A book left on a specific shelf in the library might signal a message waiting in its pages. Laundry hung in particular patterns could convey meeting times, and even the monastery cats became unwitting accomplices. Brother Thomas's frequent need to retrieve Whiskers from the convent's kitchen garden fooled nobody, especially when Whiskers was later seen contentedly sleeping in the monastery barn, nowhere near said garden. The prior's decision to ban cats from certain areas only led to more creative excuses involving escaped chickens, medicinal herb emergencies, and urgent architectural consultations about suspiciously stable walls. The seasonal liturgical calendar provided its own opportunities for coded communication. Feast days required processional movements, special musical arrangements, and collaborative preparations between communities. If Sister Agnes and Brother Paul happened to be assigned to coordinate the Candlemas procession details, well, that was simply administrative necessity. The fact that preparing a simple candle blessing somehow required 6 planning meetings in the relatively private sacristy was definitely not suspicious. Neither was the sudden epidemic of forgotten liturgical items that required last-minute fetching during services, creating brief moments of unsupervised interaction in vestry corridors. You're beginning to appreciate the sheer mental energy these religious communities poured into romantic subterfuge. The monastery's entire cultural ecosystem evolved to include these shadow communications. Older monks who'd given up on romance themselves might still pass messages for younger brothers, either from sympathy or simple entertainment. The cellarer might not ask too many questions about why certain supply requests required direct negotiation with specific convent officials. Even the most austere communities developed blind spots, because the alternative was spending all day, every day, playing detective in an endless game of romantic whack-a-mole. Sometimes, institutional blindness was simply more practical than genuine enforcement. The liturgical calendar of medieval monasteries read like a secret dating app for the desperately celibate, with feast days providing the perfect cover for all sorts of unholy mingling. You're preparing for the feast of St. John the Baptist, and the monastery is buzzing with an energy that has very little to do with commemorating the desert dwelling. Locust-eating prophet. Suddenly, everyone's volunteering to help with decorations, organize processions, and coordinate with neighboring religious houses. Brother Matthew, who normally can't be bothered to comb his hair, is suddenly concerned about the theological significance of flower arrangements and insists he needs to consult with Sister Catherine's expertise on liturgical botany immediately. Major feast days required elaborate preparations that legitimately brought different communities together. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and important saints' days meant processions, special music, shared liturgical items, and collaborative planning. The mainstream historical record shows that disciplinary infractions peaked dramatically around these celebrations. The pattern was so consistent that some bishops actually started scheduling their visitations immediately after major feasts, knowing they'd catch more violations. It's like scheduling dorm inspections right after spring break. You know you're going to find evidence of parties. You're just hoping it's nothing too shocking. You notice how the feast of St. Valentine, yes, even then, created particular anxiety among superiors, while not a major liturgical celebration. This 3rd century Martyrs' Day somehow became associated with courtly love traditions that definitely weren't supposed to penetrate monastery walls. Yet mysterious unsigned poems would appear under cell doors. Chapel flowers would be arranged in suspiciously heart-like patterns, and the usually terrible monastery wine would somehow taste a bit sweeter that day. The quirky historical detail that survived in convent records is sisters getting caught making St. Valentine's bread, shaped in forms that the abbess primly described as inappropriate for virgin consecrated to Christ, but which sound suspiciously anatomical from the description. The real action happened during vigil preparations. Setting up for a major feast required multiple trips between buildings, late-night decorating sessions, and plenty of legitimate reasons for mixed groups to work together. If Brother Paul and Sister Mary needed to spend 3 hours arranging candles in the chapel for the Easter Vigil, who could object? The fact that arranging candles apparently required whispered conferences in the sacristy corners was surely just about achieving proper liturgical symmetry. The sudden popularity of volunteering for feast preparations among younger religious was definitely due to increased piety, not the opportunity for accidental hand touches while passing ceremonial objects. Corpus Christi processions created particularly elaborate opportunities for interaction. This feast required the entire religious community to process through town streets, displaying the consecrated host in ornate monstrances. The logistics were genuinely complex, coordinating routes, arranging stopping points, organizing the order of participants, planning meetings proliferated like rabbits in spring. The processional route somehow always seemed to require rest stops at locations with convenient garden alcoves or shadowy churchyard corners. Historians still argue whether the documented tradition of processional pairs, monks and nuns walking in parallel lines, was liturgically significant or simply provided 90 minutes of prime eye contact opportunity. Musical celebrations opened another avenue for feast day fraternization. Polyphonic singing required mixed voices and extensive practice. If achieving perfect harmony demanded that Brother Marcus and Sister Lucia rehearse their parts together repeatedly, well, that was simply dedication to divine praise. The existence of numerous margin notes in choir books reading things like Hold the G longer, she likes it, suggests these rehearsals involved more than purely musical chemistry. The development of increasingly complex musical arrangements during the 13th century might have had less to do with glorifying God and more to do with justifying longer practice sessions. Even the feast day meals provided opportunities for romantic maneuvering. While regular meals were eaten in silence with spiritual readings, major celebrations allowed conversation and sometimes joint dining between affiliated communities. The careful choreography of who sat where, who served whom, and who might need to step out to fetch forgotten items from the kitchen created a complex dance of possibilities. You're watching the Easter feast preparations, and the number of essential items that have been accidentally left in various storerooms requiring paired retrieval missions would be comical if the sub-prior weren't developing a visible eye twitch. The aftermath of feasts could be just as dangerous for celibacy as the events themselves. The emotional high of celebration, combined with rich food and occasional wine, left communities in a vulnerable state. Post-feast confessions apparently ran so long that some monasteries instituted multiple confession shifts. The penances assigned for impure thoughts during divine celebrations became so standardized they had their own shorthand in penitential records. The fact that requests for discipline instruments, hair shirts, scourges, chains, peaked in the days after major feasts tells its own story about guilty consciences and belated attempts at spiritual damage control. The medieval monastery's punishment system for romantic infractions operated like a bizarre game of spiritual monopoly, where instead of jail, you got bread and water, and instead of passing go, you got to kiss the feet of your fellow monks while apologizing for your carnal weakness. You're witnessing Brother Adrian's public penance for being caught in what the official record describes as unseemly proximity with a visiting pilgrim, and the choreographed humiliation is almost impressive. He's prostrating himself in the mud outside the chapter house while his brothers file past, each required to literally step over him, a symbolic reminder that he's lower than the dirt beneath their sandals. The formal disciplinary process began with accusation in chapter, that daily meeting where faults were confessed, or, more often, reported by helpful brothers who definitely weren't motivated by jealousy or revenge. The accused would fall to their knees, admit their guilt, denial usually made things worse, and await sentencing. Punishments range from mild to medievally creative. Extra prayers? That's just a warning shot. Bread and water diet? You're getting serious. Public flogging? Now we're in proper penance territory. The mainstream historical record shows that sexual infractions typically received harsher punishments than violence or theft, because apparently God was more offended by kissing than by stealing from the poor box. But here's where human ingenuity met institutional authority. The loopholes were magnificent. Technically, the rule of St. Benedict prohibited particular friendships, but didn't explicitly define what constituted one. So when Brother Mark claimed he and Brother Luke were simply spiritual companions encouraging mutual growth in Christ, who could prove otherwise? The fact that their mutual encouragement required daily private meetings in the warming room was surely coincidental. Historians still argue whether the vague language in monastic rules was intentional, providing flexibility for superiors, or simply reflected medieval discomfort with explicitly discussing sexual matters. You discover that the punishment system created its own weird economy. Minor infractions might earn you kitchen duty, which sounds awful, until you realize the kitchen was one of the few warm places with legitimate reasons to interact with multiple people throughout the day. Isolation in a cell for prayer and contemplation, terrible for extroverts. But introverted couples discovered that synchronized punishment schedules meant being isolated in adjacent cells with surprisingly thin walls. The notorious discipline of the refectory, eating meals on the floor while others dined at tables, actually positioned you perfectly to pass notes beneath the tablecloths. The truly creative found ways to turn punishments into romantic opportunities. Assigned to copy penitential texts, perfect chance to slip personal messages between the lines of your 100th, "I shall not harbor impure thoughts." Forced to maintain silence? Well, remember that elaborate sign language system, public confession of faults. If done with enough theatrical flair, you could turn your admission of excessive attachment to earthly affections into a coded declaration of undying love that would make your beloved swoon while appearing properly penitent to authorities. The quirky historical detail that survives in monastery records is the evolution of punishment inflation. As monks became more creative in gaming the system, punishments became increasingly elaborate. Simple fasting evolved into fasting while kneeling on dried peas. Public confession expanded to include kissing the feet of every member of the community, including the kitchen cats. One 14th century abbot, clearly at his wit's end, prescribed that a monk caught in repeated infractions must wear his habit inside out for a month while ringing a bell before speaking, essentially the medieval equivalent of a scarlet letter with audio effects. Some monasteries developed graduated punishment scales that read like medieval kink manuals. First offense: 3 days bread and water. Second offense: public discipline, flogging, in chapter. Third offense: imprisonment in monastery jail. Fourth offense: excommunication and expulsion. But enforcement varied wildly depending on the offender's status, the superior's mood, and whether the monastery needed their particular skills. Brother Wolfgang might be too good a brewmaster to expel, so his romantic adventures earned medicinal penances that kept him functional. Sister Hildegard's illumination skills were irreplaceable, so her particular friendship with Sister Beatrice was studiously ignored as long as manuscripts kept flowing. The most effective avoidance strategy was probably the sudden vocation defense. Claim your inappropriate behavior stemmed from excessive religious fervor rather than base desire. That passionate embrace? You were overwhelmed by divine love and mistook your brother for Christ himself. Those love letters? Actually mystical poetry about the soul's union with God, just very metaphorical. The midnight meeting in the garden. Spontaneous prayer partnership inspired by angelic visions. Superiors face the awkward choice of calling bullshit on claimed religious experiences or potentially punishing genuine mystics. Many opted for strategic gullibility rather than risk suppressing actual divine revelations. The chronicles of medieval monastery scandals read like a greatest hits collection of human nature triumphing over institutional celibacy. And you're about to hear about the ones so spectacular they couldn't be hushed up with strategic transfers and convenient fires in the archive room. Let's start with the absolute legend of Abelard and Heloise, the 12th century power couple whose romance was so dramatically doomed it makes Romeo and Juliet look like a successful Tinder match. You've got Peter Abelard, brilliant philosopher and teacher, hired to tutor the equally brilliant Heloise, and faster than you can say inappropriate student-teacher relationship. They're secretly married and having a baby. The story gets properly medieval when Heloise's uncle, Canon Fulbert, discovers the affair and arranges for Abelard to be castrated by hired thugs. Yes, literally cutting off the problem at its source. Both lovers retreated to religious life, but their correspondence continued for decades, creating some of the most passionate love letters ever written by people supposedly dedicated to celibacy. Heloise became an abbess but never stopped loving Abelard, writing devastatingly honest letters about how she'd rather be his whore than empress of the world. The mainstream historical consensus now views their letters as authentic, meaning we have a direct window into how two brilliant minds handled forced celibacy. Spoiler alert, not well. You might think that was an isolated incident, but the records are full of scandals that make modern celebrity gossip look tame. Take the Abbey of St. Albans in 1350, where the abbot was caught running what chroniclers delicately called a house of entertainment in the monastery gatehouse. The bishop's investigation revealed a complex operation involving local women, visiting merchants, and apparently a rewards program for frequent visitors. The quirky historical detail: the abbot tried to claim it was a form of charity for poor women, which might have worked if said women hadn't been found wearing silk dresses purchased with monastery funds. The double monastery of Wotton in Yorkshire produced a scandal in 1160 that had everything: secret romance, pregnancy, escape attempts, and vigilante justice by outraged nuns. A young nun fell in love with a lay brother, got pregnant, and when discovered, the other nuns took matters into their own hands. They lured the brother to a meeting, ambushed him, and forced his lover to castrate him herself. Medieval justice at its most grotesque. The pregnant nun was chained in a cell, but then claimed the Virgin Mary appeared and miraculously removed her pregnancy. Whether divine intervention or early medieval abortion, the authorities chose to believe the miracle story rather than investigate further. The Benedictine Priory of Kirklees gives us another spectacular case from the 14th century. The prioress, Alice de Waddington, was accused of keeping her lover, a priest named William de Hotham, in apartments within the convent. But that was just the beginning. She also allegedly embezzled convent funds, hosted lavish parties, and ran the place more like a medieval Playboy mansion than a house of prayer. When investigators arrived, they found nuns wearing jewelry, keeping pets, and entertaining male visitors at all hours. The defense? They claimed it was all necessary for maintaining proper social connections for the convent's benefit. The bishop was not convinced. Even more dramatic was the case of the monk Caesarius of Heisterbach's documented story about a nun who faked her own death to escape with her lover. She arranged for a wax figure to be buried in her place while she fled to live as a married woman in another city. Years later, overcome with guilt, she returned to discover her death had been mourned, her grave visited, and miracles attributed to her remains on. The theological pretzel required to explain how a wax dummy could perform miracles while the actual saint was off living in sin makes your head spin. Historians still argue whether this was a cautionary tale or based on actual events. The Abbey of Saint-Evroult in Normandy provides a scandal with political implications. In 1140, Abbot Richard was discovered to have fathered multiple children with different women while supposedly leading a celibate community. But here's the kicker. He'd been using monastery resources to provide for his offspring, creating what amounted to a hereditary religious dynasty. His sons held key positions. His daughters were placed in convents with substantial dowries. And the whole thing only came to light when rival monasteries complained about unfair competition. The investigation revealed a network of family monasteries operating more like medieval corporations than religious houses. You're starting to see patterns in these scandals. First, they usually involved money as well as sex. Romantic entanglements provided opportunities for financial corruption. Second, they often required extensive complicity from the community. These weren't isolated individuals breaking rules, but entire systems adapting to accommodate human desires. Third, the punishments varied wildly depending on political connections and economic importance. A wealthy abbey with good royal connections might see its scandal hushed up with strategic reassignments, while a poor priory could be dissolved entirely for similar infractions. The medieval church was nothing if not practical about its priorities. Double monasteries were basically the medieval church's attempt at having their cake and eating it too, maintaining strict gender segregation while acknowledging that running religious institutions required both masculine and feminine labor divisions. You're standing at the dividing wall of Whitby Abbey, one of England's most famous double houses, and this wall is doing about as much to prevent romantic entanglements as a screen door does to stop mosquitoes. Sure, it's tall and imposing, but there are gates for necessary communication, windows for passing liturgical items, and somehow everyone knows exactly which stones are loose enough to slip messages through. The concept seemed logical enough on parchment. House monks and nuns in the same compound to share resources and infrastructure while maintaining complete separation. Men handled the heavy labor and external business. Women managed internal administration and specialized crafts. They'd share a church, but enter through different doors, sit on opposite sides, and definitely never interact beyond the absolutely necessary. The mainstream historical fact is that double monasteries were particularly common in Anglo-Saxon England and Merovingian Gaul, with some housing over 600 religious of both sexes. The quirky detail: archaeological excavations have found suspicious numbers of hairpins in areas supposedly restricted to monks and beard grooming implements in the nuns' quarters. You're learning that the architectural gymnastics required to maintain separation, while enabling functionality, created a honeycomb of opportunities. The shared church meant coordinated schedules, with monks and nuns filing past each other during shift changes. The necessity of confession created legitimate one-on-one interactions, albeit supposedly through screens. The infirmary often served both communities, because apparently germs respected gender segregation as much as hormones did, which is to say, not at all. When Sister Agnes developed a suspicious cough that required Brother Thomas's specialized herbal knowledge, well, medicine demanded proximity. The abbess of a double monastery wielded extraordinary power, often ruling over both male and female communities. This created fascinating dynamics where monks had to obey a woman, something that went against general medieval gender hierarchies and created its own tensions. Some abbesses used this authority creatively, like Abbess Euphemia of Wherwell, who allegedly assigned her favorite monks to tasks that required frequent consultations in her private chambers. When questioned, she produced elaborate theological justifications about spiritual motherhood that left visiting bishops too confused to argue. The daily logistics of double monasteries read like a complex dance routine designed by committee. Laundry days required coordinated schedules to avoid mixed undergarments, the horror. Meal preparation involved elaborate systems to ensure food passed from male to female sections without hands touching. The mainstream historical record shows increasingly complex rules developing over time. First, simple separation, then requirements for intermediary servants. Finally, rotating schedules so communities barely overlapped. Each new rule suggests previous failures, like a medieval game of romantic whack-a-mole. Here's where it gets really interesting. Feast day preparations in double monasteries. Major celebrations required both communities to work together. And suddenly, you had legitimate reasons for mixed meetings. The Feast of the Virgin Mary particularly challenged gender separation, as both monks and nuns claimed special devotion. Planning committees proliferated, preparatory meetings multiplied, and somehow decorating the church for Assumption required weeks of close collaboration. The careful choreography of who stood where during processions provided opportunity for strategic positioning. Brother Matthew's mysterious ability to always process directly across from Sister Catherine was surely coincidental. The economic interdependence of double monasteries created additional complications. Nuns often produced fine textiles and manuscripts that monks marketed outside. This required quality control meetings, production planning sessions, and financial discussions. If Brother Paul needed to spend hours in the scriptorium reviewing Sister Mary's illuminations for theological accuracy, that was simply due diligence. The fact that their collaborative manuscripts contained marginalia with suspicious numbers of entwined vines and paired birds was artistic license, nothing more. Historians still argue whether double monasteries experienced higher rates of scandal or just better documentation due to their complexity. The visitors' reports from these institutions read like medieval soap operas. The wall between sections has developed convenient gaps. Night offices see suspicious movements between buildings. The abbess reports discipline issues beyond her ability to correct. My favorite documented complaint comes from the Bishop of Winchester in 1387, who noted that the double monastery of Wherwell had developed a tradition of necessary conversations that somehow required wine and occurred primarily after Compline. The defense mechanisms double monasteries developed were impressive. When caught in compromising situations, inhabitants became suddenly devoted to obscure theological points requiring immediate discussion. That midnight meeting, urgent debate about the nature of divine grace, those love poems, actually allegories about Christ and the Church. You just need to understand the symbolism. The paired walks in the garden, mutual instruction in botanical theology, obviously. The prior and prioress, who resigned simultaneously to pursue hermitic vocations in the same general geographic area. Complete coincidence. Why would you even suggest otherwise? The confession booth in medieval monasteries operated like the world's most conflicted dating app, where your spiritual advisor might simultaneously absolve your sins and develop some highly inappropriate feelings about your detailed descriptions of carnal temptation. You're kneeling in the dim confessional, separated from Brother Francis by a wooden screen that's supposed to ensure anonymity. But let's be real. In a community of 50 people, everyone knows everyone's voice, gait, and probably their distinctive breathing patterns when Sister Mary starts confessing her impure thoughts about a certain brother who shall remain nameless, but who has beautiful hands and reads the gospel with such passion. Brother Francis knows exactly who she means, and suddenly his own spiritual life gets a lot more complicated. The sacrament of confession puts celibate religious in the position of hearing intimate details about desires they were supposed to have transcended. The theological framework required complete honesty from penitents and compassionate understanding from confessors, creating an atmosphere of emotional intimacy that absolutely wasn't supposed to lead anywhere. The mainstream historical record shows that solicitation in the confessional, using confession to seduce penitents, was common enough to require extensive ecclesiastical legislation. By the 13th century, multiple papal bulls addressed this issue, which tells you everything about how well those celibacy vows were working out. You discover that the medieval confession manual reads like the world's most thorough sex survey, requiring specific details about impure thoughts and actions. Did you touch yourself? Where? For how long? Did you achieve completion? Were you thinking of someone specific? If so, their state in life matters. Single, married, religious? The confessor needed these details to assign appropriate penance. But imagine being a young monk who joined at age 12, never experienced romance, and suddenly you're hearing Sister Catherine describe her dreams about muscular farmers in vivid detail. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain purely spiritual concern while processing this information would challenge anyone. The physical setup of confession created its own problems. While some monasteries had proper confessionals with screens, many relied on improvised arrangements. A curtained corner in the church, a partially enclosed chapel space, or even just kneeling beside the seated confessor with a cloth held between you. The intimacy was unavoidable. You could hear each other breathing, smell the herbs they'd crushed in their clothes, feel the warmth of proximity. When Brother Thomas accidentally brushed Sister Agnes's hand while giving her penance beads, that touch might be the most human contact either had experienced in years. Here's the quirky historical detail that survives in penitential records. Some confessors developed specialties that seemed suspiciously targeted. Brother Hugh became known for his gentle handling of sins of the flesh, attracting long lines of penitents seeking his understanding approach. Sister Beatrice developed expertise in spiritual friendship gone astray, offering advice that sounded remarkably specific and personal. The fact that these specialist confessors often developed their own spiritual crises shortly afterward was surely unrelated to their extensive exposure to others' romantic struggles. The power dynamics in confession created particularly toxic situations. Your confessor knew your darkest secrets, your weakest moments, your most persistent temptations. In the wrong hands, this knowledge became leverage. Father, I've been having impure thoughts. My child, I understand completely. In fact, I've been struggling with similar thoughts. Perhaps we could pray together privately about this shared burden. The documented cases of confessors suggesting that sexual sins could be absolved through sexual acts, the medieval equivalent of "this is actually therapeutic," show how badly this system could be abused. But confession also facilitated romance in subtler ways. The requirement for regular confession meant scheduled private meetings with someone who understood your struggles. For monks and nuns experiencing same-sex attraction in an era that barely had language for it, the confessional might be the only place to speak these feelings aloud. Some confessor-penitent relationships evolved into deep emotional bonds that danced on the edge of propriety. The correspondence between confessors and their spiritual children often reads like love letters, with a thin veneer of religious vocabulary. The Reformed Cistercians tried to address these issues by requiring monks to confess to the abbot, rather than choosing their own confessor. But this created new problems. Imagine admitting your lustful thoughts about Brother Marcus to the abbot, who then had to maintain authority while knowing that half his community was fantasizing about the other half. Some abbots' private journals from this period read like exhausted therapist notes. Brother A confessed attraction to Brother B, who last week confessed attraction to Brother C, who is definitely sleeping with Brother D based on what Brother E reported. The administrative nightmare of managing a supposedly celibate community, where everyone was confessing attractions to everyone else, must have been spectacular. Historians still argue whether the confessional ultimately helped or hindered celibacy. On one hand, It provided a release valve for expressing forbidden desires verbally rather than physically. On the other hand, it created intimate bonds between confessors and penitents, normalized discussion of sexual desire, and sometimes facilitated the very relationships it was meant to prevent. The fact that medieval church councils repeatedly legislated against confession-related improprieties suggests they were fighting a losing battle against human nature, armed with institutional intimacy. The monastery garden was essentially a medieval pharmacy, sex education center, an emergency contraception clinic, all rolled into one, tended by monks and nuns who definitely weren't supposed to know. As much as they did about preventing or terminating pregnancies. You're walking through the herb garden with Brother Ambrose, the infirmarian, and his knowledge of women's herbs is suspiciously comprehensive for someone who's supposedly been celibate since age 14. He points out pennyroyal, rue, and tansy with the practiced ease of someone who's prepared these particular tinctures more times than the official records would suggest, muttering something about treating excessive monthly flows with a perfectly straight face. The monastic herbal manuscripts are fascinating documents in creative euphemism. Officially, these plants treated obstruction of the flowers, retention of the menses, or corruption of the womb. Unofficially, everyone knew that a strong dose of pennyroyal tea could restore the monthly courses, even when the obstruction was distinctly baby-shaped. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries were the primary centers of medical knowledge, and their herbals contained extensive information about fertility, contraception, and abortion. The quirky detail: some manuscripts include margin notes warning that certain herbs should be kept locked away from the younger sisters, lest they be tempted to improper use. You notice how certain plants in the monastery garden are strategically placed. The dangerous herbs grow in the locked physic garden, accessible only to senior religious, while the culinary herbs sprawl freely near the kitchen. But knowledge has a way of spreading, especially when the consequences of ignorance could be catastrophic. That serving girl who helps in the infirmary picks up more than just basic wound care. The young monk assigned to garden duty learns which plants should never be mixed with wine unless you want to spend 3 days convinced you're conversing with angels. The infirmarian's position created unique challenges in maintaining communal celibacy. They possessed knowledge about bodies, all bodies, that most medieval people never acquired. They understood conception, recognized pregnancy signs, and knew how to treat its complications. When Sister Marguerite presented with mysterious morning nausea and melancholic humours concentrated in the womb, Brother Ambrose faced an ethical dilemma. Church law condemned abortion, but canon law also valued avoiding scandal. The delicate dance of providing treatment for irregular menses while maintaining plausible deniability required verbal gymnastics that would impress a modern lawyer. Here's where the historical record gets particularly interesting. Monastery infirmary records show suspicious patterns in herbal remedy requests. Spring saw increased demand for cooling herbs to treat excessive heat of the blood, medieval code for dampening libido. Autumn brought requests for purgative treatments that happened to coincide with herbs known to prevent implantation. The correlation between these requests and the timing of major feast days 9 months prior was surely coincidental. Historians still argue whether infirmarians actively enabled sexual relationships through strategic blindness or genuinely believed they were treating unrelated conditions. The knowledge of contraceptive herbs wasn't limited to the infirmary. Manuscripts circulated between monasteries, and with them came marginalia, adding local variations and personal observations. Sister H reports that wild carrot seeds taken immediately after intercourse prevent conception. Brother Augustine notes that mint consumed in quantity reduces male ardor. These additions suggest extensive practical experimentation that definitely violated multiple vows. The fact that such notes survived rather than being scraped away indicates either approval or resignation from monastery authorities. Some monasteries developed reputations for particular medical specialties that sound suspiciously targeted. The convent at Warewell became known for treating women's complaints, attracting noble ladies seeking discreet solutions to inconvenient pregnancies. The abbey at Reading specialized in male vigor remedies, which could mean either enhancing or suppressing, depending on your needs and ability to communicate in euphemism. These specializations created networks of knowledge and referral that operated entirely through ecclesiastical channels while serving decidedly secular purposes. The theological implications of this herbal knowledge created fascinating mental gymnastics. Technically, preventing conception wasn't the same as terminating pregnancy, a distinction that allowed for all sorts of rationalization. If Brother Paul provided Sister Mary with a packet of herbs to regulate her humours, without asking too many questions about why her humours needed regulating, was he complicit in sin or simply providing medical care? The careful documentation in infirmary records suggests many religious chose strategic ignorance. Record the complaint as presented, provide the standard treatment, ask no follow-up questions. You're beginning to understand that the monastery garden represented a form of power that complicated the official hierarchy. A young nun with herbal knowledge might possess information that could destroy reputations or save them. An infirmarian could enable or prevent scandals through selective dispensing of remedies. The garden itself became a politically charged space where access meant access to both healing and harm. The fact that many monasteries eventually restricted garden access to senior religious only confirms that authorities recognized the dangerous knowledge growing between the rosemary and sage. The economics of medieval monasteries created a fascinating paradox where vows of poverty met the reality of institutional wealth. And nothing loosened those strict celibacy rules quite like the sweet smell of money and power. You're sitting in on a chapter meeting where they're discussing the appointment of a new cellarer, and the political maneuvering would make Machiavelli take notes. Brother Hugh has the best qualifications, but Brother William has something more valuable, a wealthy merchant father who's hinted at substantial donations if his son receives appropriate responsibilities. Suddenly, Brother William's known friendship with a certain merchant's daughter becomes less of a liability and more of a potential business connection. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers. They were economic powerhouses owning vast estates, controlling trade routes, and managing resources that would make modern corporations envious. This wealth required management, and management required dealing with the outside world, including its women. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 13th century, many monasteries controlled thousands of acres and generated income equivalent to major noble houses. The quirky detail: some monasteries actually maintained guest houses in nearby towns, officially for conducting business. But these facilities developed reputations for hosting meetings that had nothing to do with grain prices. You notice how certain positions within the monastery hierarchy came with built-in excuses for external interaction. The cellarer managed supplies and finances, requiring frequent trips to markets and meetings with merchants. The almoner distributed charity, necessitating contact with the poor and disadvantaged, including vulnerable women who might be grateful for assistance. the guest master welcomed visitors, some of whom arrived with suspiciously frequent spiritual concerns requiring private consultation. These roles became so associated with temptation that some reform movements tried rotating them monthly. But this just meant more monks got exposed to worldly temptations rather than containing the risk to a few. The practice of monasteries educating noble children created another economically motivated breach in gender segregation. Wealthy families paid handsomely for their daughters to receive education in convents and their sons in monasteries. These child oblates grew up together, forming bonds that were supposed to be sibling-like, but sometimes developed differently when hormones kicked in. When young Lord Robert, educated at the monastery since age 7, reached 18 and suddenly developed urgent spiritual questions requiring Sister Margaret's guidance, Margaret, whom he'd known since childhood, the economic incentive to keep the generous donations flowing often outweighed strict enforcement of separation rules. Here's where it gets really interesting: the role of lay servants and workers. Monasteries needed extensive labor forces, people to work the fields, tend the animals, maintain buildings, and these lay workers lived in peripheral buildings, followed modified rules, and occupied a liminal space between religious and secular life. They provided perfect cover for relationships, as they could move relatively freely between monastery and town. If Brother Thomas needed to inspect the work at the monastery's mill, and the miller's daughter happened to be there, well, economic oversight demanded thoroughness. The number of monastery servants who coincidentally had children with suspicious timing and distinctive features suggests these inspections were very thorough indeed. The economic pressure to maintain good relations with benefactors created spectacular conflicts of interest. When Lady Isabella, major donor and patron, arrived for her annual visit with her entourage of young ladies in waiting, the abbot faced a dilemma. Strict enforcement of cloister rules might offend the woman whose donations kept the monastery solvent, but allowing her ladies to attend services, take meals in the guest house, and tour the gardens with young monks as guides, that was asking for trouble. The documented compromises, special viewing galleries for noble women, separate but parallel dining facilities, carefully chaperoned but permitted interactions, show economics trumping theology. The development of medieval credit and banking systems, often centered in monasteries, created new opportunities for strategic relationships. Monks who managed financial instruments needed to meet with Italian bankers, Jewish moneylenders, and merchant princes. These meetings couldn't always happen in the austere surroundings of the chapter house. Sometimes they required dinner at the banker's house, where his daughter might join the meal for propriety's sake. Sometimes they necessitated traveling to distant fairs where all sorts of temptations lurked. The senior monk's need for an assistant on these journeys, preferably someone young and quick with numbers, created opportunities for exposure to worldly pleasures that no amount of supervision could fully prevent. Historians still argue whether the wealth of monasteries ultimately undermined or reinforced celibacy rules. Rich monasteries could afford better walls, stricter supervision, and the luxury of turning away problematic members. But they also attracted people motivated by comfort rather than calling, required more interaction with secular society, and created power structures where sexual indiscretions could be bought off rather than punished. The correlation between monastery wealth and documented scandals suggests money complicated celibacy as much as it facilitated holiness. The manuscript margins of medieval monasteries contain more repressed sexuality than a Victorian novel, with supposedly celibate scribes channeling their forbidden desires into increasingly elaborate doodles of things that definitely weren't meant to inspire prayer. You're bent over a beautifully illuminated Book of Hours in the scriptorium, supposedly checking for theological errors, but you can't help noticing that the decorative borders contain an unusual number of rabbits engaged in activities that would make a modern reader blush. When you glance at Brother Marcus, who painted these suspiciously energetic bunnies, he's studiously avoiding eye contact while working on his current project, a martyrdom scene where the saint bears a remarkable resemblance to that visiting Dominican scholar. The official purpose of manuscript illumination was to glorify God through beauty and aid in meditation, but the actual output suggests many monks had other things on their minds. The mainstream historical record shows that marginal illustrations, called marginalia, became increasingly elaborate and secular during the 13th and 14th centuries. The quirky detail that art historians politely skip over, the sheer volume of genitalia hidden in foliage patterns, suggestive positioning of supposedly innocent animals, and acrobatic figures engaged in activities that required impressive flexibility and definitely weren't prayer positions. You notice patterns in the manuscript production that suggest sublimation working overtime. Brother Francis, who hasn't left the monastery in 20 years, produces the most sensual depictions of female saints you've ever seen, all perfectly theological, of course. But those martyred virgins seem to be enjoying their torture a bit too much. Sister Agnes's specialty is muscular angels wrestling demons, and her attention to anatomical detail on those heavenly bodies suggests either divine inspiration or a very active imagination. The way she renders Michael's thighs as he pins down Lucifer makes you wonder if she's been sneaking peeks at the stable boys during harvest time. The collaborative nature of manuscript production created its own opportunities for encoded communication. Major illuminated works required teams, scribes for text, artists for major illustrations, specialists for decorated initials, and assistants for background patterns. If Brother Paul handled the text and Sister Mary the decorations, their work sessions required extensive coordination. Those tiny figures hidden in the elaborate initial letters, visible only to someone examining the page closely. They tell stories that have nothing to do with salvation. A knight pursuing a lady through intricate vine scrolls, two rabbits sharing a very human embrace, a mermaid whose expression suggests she's thinking about more than drowning sailors. Here's where the sublimation gets really creative. The theological justifications for sensual artwork, the Song of Songs, that biblical erotic poem, awkwardly reinterpreted as Christ's love for the church, provided cover for all sorts of artistic expression. When questioned about the rather bodice-ripping nature of his illustrations for "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth," Brother Johannes could claim he was depicting spiritual ecstasy. The fact that his sponsor, the Church's bride, looks suspiciously like Sister Catherine was purely because all beauty reflects divine beauty. Obviously, the development of books of hours for lay patrons created new challenges and opportunities. These personal prayer books often featured customized illustrations, and wealthy patrons had specific requests. When Lady Margaret commissioned a book of hours featuring herself as various female saints, the young monk assigned to paint her spent hours studying her features to ensure accurate representation of pious devotion. The number of preparatory sketches that survived in monastery collections, showing progressive idealization of patron features, suggests some artists found their subjects more inspiring than strictly necessary for theological purposes. You discover that certain scriptoria developed reputations for particular styles that attracted specific clientele. The monastery at Tours became known for vivid spiritual narratives that included surprisingly detailed bedroom scenes for stories that could have been told more discreetly. Winchester specialized in mythological marginalia that provided cover for depicting nude figures. After all, those pagan stories needed illustration to show their error, right? The fact that errors of the flesh received far more artistic attention than errors of pride or greed was surely coincidental. The physical toll of manuscript work, hunched posture, strained eyes, cramped hands, created its own form of mortification that some monks embraced as penance for impure thoughts. Others found that the meditative nature of repetitive decoration allowed minds to wander down dangerous paths. The margin notes in some manuscripts read like stream of consciousness therapy sessions. Lord, grant me strength against temptation, written in the same hand that just drew an unnecessarily anatomically correct Adam. Or, thoughts of Brother H disturb my prayers, squeezed between lines of perfectly copied scripture. Historians still argue whether the sensual nature of much medieval religious art represents successful sublimation or its complete failure. Did channeling desire into artistic expression actually help maintain celibacy? Or did it create a feedback loop of visual stimulation? The fact that reform movements periodically demanded simpler artwork, only to see elaboration creep back within a generation, suggests the human need for beauty, and possibly more, consistently triumphed over austere theological ideals. Reform movements swept through medieval monasteries like recurring fever dreams, each one promising to finally, definitively enforce that pesky celibacy requirement, and each one failing in new and creative ways that would have been hilarious if the reformers weren't so deadly serious. You're witnessing the arrival of the latest batch of Cistercian reformers at your comfortable Benedictine house. And they stride in with the energy of people who've been living on bread and water for Lent since October. Their leader, Prior Austere, probably not his real name, but it might as well be, takes one look at your heated dormitory, cushioned choir stalls, and well-stocked wine cellar, and his left eye starts twitching with righteous indignation. The cycle was predictable as seasons. A monastery would start with high ideals and strict observance, gradually relax as human nature asserted itself, attract reform-minded zealots who'd impose harsh new rules, drive out or convert the comfortable, maintain strictness for maybe a generation, then slowly slide back into laxity. The mainstream historical record documents at least 6 major reform movements between the 10th and 15th centuries, each claiming previous reforms hadn't gone far enough. The quirky detail: some monks became reform tourism specialists, moving between houses just ahead of the latest crackdown, like medieval couch surfers avoiding responsibility. You watch the reformers implement their standard playbook. First, architectural modifications, blocking up convenient doorways, installing locks on previously accessible areas, removing those cushioned seats that made 8 daily prayer services bearable. Next, schedule changes, earlier rising times, because 2 a.m. wasn't early enough, longer fasts, more manual labor. Then the social restructuring, breaking up established friendships, reassigning work partners, instituting random cell inspections. The theory was that exhausted, hungry, constantly supervised monks wouldn't have energy for romance. The reality was that desperate people get creative. The Cluniac reforms of the 10th century focused on liturgical elaboration. If monks spent more time in church, they'd have less time for mischief. This led to prayer services so long that monks perfected the art of sleeping while standing, leaning on misericords, those flip-up seats designed to provide minimal support during marathon prayers. The unintended consequence? All those hours in church created perfect opportunities for meaningful glances across the choir, synchronized breathing during chants, and the development of elaborate codes based on psalm verse emphasis. When Brother Matthew stressed certain words during his canticle solo, Sister Agnes knew exactly which garden path to take during afternoon recreation. Here's where reform movements consistently shot themselves in the foot. They required detailed documentation of the problems they were addressing. Visitators, reform inspectors, compiled extensive lists of infractions, creating permanent records of creative rule-breaking that would otherwise have been forgotten. Reading these visitation reports is like accessing medieval monastery gossip blogs. Brother Simon and Brother Paul share a cell despite repeated prohibitions. Sister Margaret claims illness whenever Sister Joan is assigned kitchen duty. The entire community seems afflicted with a coughing disease that only manifests during silent periods. These reports, meant to shame communities into compliance, now serve as instruction manuals for what was possible despite supervision. The Cistercian reform, which claimed to return to primitive Benedictine simplicity, inadvertently created new opportunities through their emphasis on agricultural work. Sending monks out to remote granges, agricultural estates, with minimal supervision was like creating medieval dating retreats. Sure, they were supposed to maintain silence and focus on holy labor, but when Brother Thomas and Brother Francis spent 3 months alone together tending sheep in an isolated valley, the temptation to redefine pastoral care proved overwhelming. The number of grange assignments that resulted in mysterious illnesses requiring both brothers to return early suggests the reformers hadn't thought this through. The mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, introduced mobility as their reform innovation. Instead of being trapped in one monastery, friars traveled between houses and into the secular world. This was supposed to prevent the comfortable corruption of stable communities. Instead, it created opportunities for romantic encounters without long-term consequences. That charming Dominican preacher who stirred such spiritual fervor during his Lenten mission. He'd be 3 towns away before anyone noticed Sister Catherine's increased devotion to private prayer coincided with mysterious absences. The visiting Franciscan who needed a local guide to show him where the poor lived. Somehow these tours required multiple evenings and routes through remarkably secluded areas. You're starting to see the pattern. Every reform created new loopholes, stricter cloister rules, developed better climbing skills, separation of communities, perfected long-distance communication, random cell assignments, created excitement through variety. This month's neighbor might be that cute novice from Toledo. The reformers' frustration bleeds through their writings. We have instituted every possible precaution, writes one exhausted visitor, yet still these religious find ways to corrupt each other with particular affections. The fact that he goes on to list 17 new rules suggests he knew he was fighting a losing battle. The legacy of medieval monastery romance lives on in ways that would mortify those poor reformers who spent centuries trying to enforce celibacy. Because here you are in the 21st century, still fascinated by the sex lives of people who supposedly didn't have any. You're browsing Netflix and notice how many historical dramas feature hot monks and naughty nuns. From The Name of the Rose to Pillars of the Earth, each one presenting medieval religious life as basically The Bachelor with better architecture and worse hygiene. The modern imagination seems incapable of accepting that thousands of people successfully maintain celibacy, preferring to believe every monastery was a hotbed of repressed passion, just waiting for the right historical novelist to expose it. The romanticization started early. Medieval secular literature was already full of lecherous monks and seductive abbesses by the 13th century. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales presents religious figures who treat their vows as suggestions rather than commandments. And his audiences laughed knowingly because everyone had stories about the local monastery. The mainstream historical consensus now recognizes that these literary stereotypes, while exaggerated, reflected real social anxieties about celibate communities. The quirky detail. Some medieval monasteries actually banned secular literature, not for its worldly content, but because monks found the clerical characters' romantic adventures too relatable and potentially inspiring. You see the influence in modern language itself. Get Thee to a Nunnery wasn't originally about purity. Nunneries in Shakespeare's time had reputations as either reform schools for wayward women or convenient places to stash inconvenient pregnancies. The phrase monk's cell evokes austere isolation, but you now know those cells saw plenty of non-contemplative activities. When someone jokes about breaking vows, everyone understands the reference because collective cultural memory preserves the image of the lustful monk better than the chaste one. Even missionary position carries assumptions about what those missionaries were really doing between converting the heathens. The archaeological evidence keeps undermining the official narrative. Excavations at medieval monasteries regularly uncover children's toys in areas where no children should have been, female jewelry in male dormitories, and suspicious numbers of private chambers that don't match official building plans. DNA analysis of cemetery remains sometimes reveals family relationships that definitely shouldn't exist in celibate communities. Each discovery prompts academic papers delicately discussing irregular domestic arrangements and non-canonical household structures, which is scholarly speak for these monks were totally doing it. Here's what's really fascinating. The modern Catholic Church's ongoing struggles with clerical celibacy echo medieval challenges almost exactly. The same arguments appear. Celibacy enables complete devotion to God versus humans aren't designed for lifelong abstinence. The same problems manifest. Secret relationships, abuse of power dynamics, elaborate cover-ups to avoid scandal. The same solutions get proposed. Better screening, stricter supervision, reformed seminary training. Historians still argue whether mandatory clerical celibacy is a beautiful spiritual discipline or an impossible standard that creates more problems than it solves, using medieval precedents to support both positions. The pop culture obsession with sexy medieval religious figures reveals modern anxieties about sexuality and repression. Every generation reinterprets monastery romance through its own lens. Victorians portrayed it as Gothic horror, dark desires in darker corridors. The 1960s saw it as liberation narrative, free love triumphing over institutional oppression. Modern versions often focus on consent and power dynamics, examining how hierarchical religious structures enabled exploitation. The enduring appeal suggests we're still working through questions about desire, control, and the possibility of transcending physical needs. You realize that medieval monastery romance matters because it represents a massive natural experiment in human sexuality. What happens when you take thousands of people across centuries and tell them to suppress one of the most fundamental human drives? The answer, written in visitation records and marginalia, love letters and penitentials, is that human nature usually finds a way, not always, Plenty of medieval religious probably did maintain their vows, but enough didn't that we have extensive documentation of failure, creative adaptation, and the endless ingenuity of people trying to connect despite institutional barriers. The real legacy might be the inadvertent honesty of the historical record. Medieval chroniclers could have destroyed evidence of clerical sexuality, presented sanitized histories of perfect celibacy. Instead, they documented the failures alongside the successes, creating an unexpectedly human portrait of religious life. These weren't plaster saints, but people struggling with desires they couldn't always control, finding love in impossible circumstances, and sometimes choosing human connection over heavenly rewards. Their stories survive not as cautionary tales, but as proof that some human needs transcend rules, walls, and even the threat of eternal damnation. The bell for Compline is ringing across the centuries, calling you back from this journey through medieval desires and failures. You've seen how stone walls couldn't contain human hearts, how elaborate rules created elaborate evasions, how the very intensity of repression generated equal and opposite attractions. The monks and nuns who broke their vows weren't necessarily weak or wicked. They were human beings caught between institutional demands and natural desires, navigating that tension with creativity, courage, and occasional catastrophic failure. Their struggles created a historical record that's simultaneously sacred and profane, serious and absurd, tragic and surprisingly relatable. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of moonlit cloisters and whispered prayers that weren't entirely addressing the divine. Maybe you'll imagine the scratch of quills writing love letters disguised as theological treatises, or the soft footfall of sandaled feet sneaking through shadows toward forbidden embraces. The medieval monastery in your dreams might echo with both sacred chants and suppressed sighs, where every arch and alcove holds secrets, and where the highest walls couldn't quite reach heaven because they were built by humans who remained stubbornly, beautifully earthbound. Let these ancient stones and their hidden stories fade now into the comfortable darkness of your modern bedroom, where love needs no permission and desires face no punishment beyond perhaps a mildly awkward morning. The monks and nuns of centuries past have finished their tales of romance and rebellion, and it's time for you to rest, free from bells calling you to midnight prayer, free from the weight of impossible vows, free to dream whatever dreams your unconfined heart desires, sweet dreams. And remember, if you wake at 2 a.m., it's probably just your neighbor's cat, not the monastery bell calling you to matins. Though if you do hear mysterious chanting, well, now you know what might really be going on behind those cloistered walls.